Hello and welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, joined by my co-host, Matt Duraldi.
What's going on, guys?
And we'll be coming to you today with a Superflex strategy video. So we'll be getting into, all different types, right? If you're a new player to Superflex, if you're considering Superflex, or if you're a more seasoned Superflex player, we'll be looking at some strategies overall for the league, some ways to set up the league, and we look forward to continuing to bring you Superflex content as much as we possibly can. So if you are here for the Superflex content, make sure you stay with us. Make sure you continue to follow and subscribe. And so without further ado, here are some tips to help dominate your Superflex draft. And the first one is a big one. And I know it's kind of cliche to say, but you need to know your league settings. So obviously the number of teams, 8, 10, and 12 will determine how aggressive you need to be at quarterback. If you have a scoring format that's standard, make sure that you know that in standard formats, when there's less points to be scored, the quarterbacks are even that much more important. If you're in half PPR, PPR, the other positions do become a little bit more important because there's more points to be scored. And you want to know how many receivers, how many flex spots, how many positions you actually have to fill, because the less number of positions in your starting lineup also makes the quarterbacks that much more important. So if you have 2 running back, 2 receiver, and a flex, that is the format where quarterback is going to be the most important. You want to try and get as much of an edge at quarterback if you don't have to fill very many other positions. We talk about 3 wide receiver all the time. Highly recommend doing it because then the positions that aren't quarterbacks also become more important. There's more points to be scored at those positions, and you want to make sure that you're not just ignoring those spots, and end up drafting somebody really late that you're going to have to start. So overall, that's very important. And the last thing that you want to make sure you know is how many IR spots that you have. If you have a lot of IR spots and you can afford to sit on some injured players, or you can kind of lean into running back a little bit more if you have more IR spots. So you want to make sure that you have a command on what your league settings are and how that is going to impact how you draft.
Yeah, all very good points. And looking at kind of the draft strategy specifically to quarterbacks in these various team setups. Now, 12-team, Superflex leagues are not quite as common just because you're going to be starting, 24 quarterbacks each and every week. But in those drafts, you really got to hammer them early. So, when we've done mock drafts and live drafts for 12-team leagues, they really fly off the board. If you miss out, you're going to be in a hole that you really can't dig yourself out of throughout the year. Now, in 10-team leagues, we typically have been a little bit more patient with quarterback because you're only starting 20 overall each and every given week. There's, 3 guys to go around for each and every team. Now, you still probably will see guys, 4 or 5 quarterbacks at least off the board in the first round, but just know that you can wait. And the same goes with 8-team leagues. Let's say, for example, you're in 8-team Superflex league for the first time, and you're looking at Superflex rankings, and you see a laundry list of quarterbacks. You don't necessarily have to abide by that, and we'll get into that, when we talk about curating your own rankings, because you're only starting 16 quarterbacks throughout the league each and every week. So you can be patient and attack other positions and get premium guys when other people are going to be filling out their quarterback room, whereas you can, be patient.
Yeah, and then the second point here, right, is analyzing your previous drafts. This cannot be understated, right? We can sit up here and talk about our experiences and how much we like certain players and what our overall rankings are, what our overall draft strategy is, but you need to know how the other players in your league are going to draft. If you're in a 10-team league and the first 2 rounds, 18 quarterbacks are going to be gone, I don't know that you necessarily want to wait that long. You might want to consider getting in on a quarterback earlier than we would in our league when the first 2 rounds maybe have 7 quarterbacks, right? So you want to make sure that you know how your league is drafting so that you're able to kind of attack the positional values when they present themselves. So overall, I think the quarterback strategy is the biggest one in this. If you have a 12-team league where all the quarterbacks fly off the board, you want to make sure you get at least one during that time. In an 8-team league, I don't think you really need to do that. You can kind of lock in high-end players. Maybe you can get like a CeeDee Lamb and a Tyreek Hill and then try and get your quarterbacks later, and quarterback 14, 15, 16 is more than enough to keep you in it when you have big positional advantages at other spots. So, you want to make sure that you know the drafters, right? And if you're just switching to Superflex, I think a good way to look at the quarterbacks is see how aggressive they are in one quarterback leagues, right? If you have the guy every year that drafts Mahomes in the first round, right? Like that seems to be a common thing, or you have Josh Allen going early. Like Superflex is only gonna push those guys to draft more quarterbacks. So you want to make sure that um, kind of going in, and you have an expectation going in of where the quarterbacks can be drafted.
That's a
Um,
good point. And it's also a lot of fun to look back at previous drafts and, talk about the picks that you hit on, but really trash talk your buddies for pushing a guy like Daniel Jones up the board last year. All these different mistakes that people
Jahan
made.
Dotson.
Right, right. Tyler Higbee. Uh,
Just
if you're in
dunking
our
on
league,
Hamza.
if you're in our league and listening to this, we are talking about one of our best friends and cutting him some shade, but it's true. I mean, it is a lot of fun, and hopefully if you guys do get together, for the draft, it adds an element of trash talking too. But yeah, it's very easy to use. I mean, we use Sleeper. You can just look at all the previous years. I know all the other platforms you can look at historical data as well. So it's something that I don't think that everyone does, but it does seem pretty obvious and will help you out quite a bit.
Yeah. And I think another spot that is really helpful to analyze your previous drafts on is tight end. Making sure you know where tight ends generally go. And obviously it can change from year to year, but for the most part, you have kind of a feel of where teams feel comfortable getting in on the tight end, and where you might be able to get tight end 6, where you might be able to get tight end 8, where you might be able to get tight end 12. Those type of things matter. Getting to the tight end at the right time during your draft, I think, is very important. So just taking a peek at that from a year, maybe the last 2 years, and make sure that you're ready to attack the tight end position, and that you get some practice with teams that have tight ends maybe pushed up further than you're comfortable, or maybe you wait and you're able to strike at a later time. So making sure you have a plan at tight end, I think, is worth. And then the last thing we have here on this point, right, is upside versus stability. You kind of want to make sure early in your draft that you have some stability. Taking big time upside earlier in your draft can work out, but if it doesn't, then you're going to be behind the 8 ball all year trying to make up the gap for the teams that have more consistent producers from their top end picks. And, obviously we can talk about the players specifically, like Amon-Ra St. Brown. That's one of the reasons I pushed him up, is because he is so stable, versus maybe a guy like Puka Nacua, who has a lot of upside, but could also have quite a bit of downside. So I know that's not a great comparison because that's like a first versus a second round pick. But even in the second round, I still think Puka has quite a bit of upside and downside and stability questions where a lot of the other guys there don't. Maybe like you take Saquon Barkley instead, right? Who's going to be very stable, good offense, good offensive line. So,
And that's a really good point
sure.
too, because we did a mock draft episode last week where we did a 10-team Superflex, and one of the teams that the computer drafted had Jaden Daniels, Caleb Williams, Garrett Wilson, Drake London, and it was like all of these guys that could be very high upside players, but there was not necessarily that balance of stability. And if those guys don't work out, they're in for a tough season. So just be cognizant of that. Don't fall in love with every camp report. Like, do your homework and be smart about it.
Yeah, and that, even within the rankings, there's something to be said about a player that just is year over year over year the same, right? Year over year over year, you can count on production, and obviously a guy like London who has all the upside in the world, but we haven't seen it yet. That's a good example of somebody that has upside, but maybe not the stability you're looking for. All right, so going into our third point here, we have curate your own rankings and tiers. This is a big one for both of us, right? Especially the tiers section. Even if you're just working off of a piece of paper you print out, right? Make sure you mark the guys that you like better than the ranking that they're at, that you like better, maybe a tier up from where they're ranked. And make sure that you have this outlined, because when you're going through the draft, guys will pop out clearly, right? You're sitting on the board and you have 3 guys in your quarterback tier, you have 1 guy in your running back tier, and you have 3 or 4 guys in your wide receiver tier. And when you draft like that, like the running back sticks out there so clearly, if that's how you prepared, that you just take the best value, take the running back, get that guy in your tier, and then the next round you can maybe get one of the quarterbacks that you wanted in your tier or the receivers, because there's a lot of players available within those tiers. It is so important to attack the value in that way that if you're not doing it and somebody else in your league is doing it, you're going to be at a big disadvantage because you're not going to see the board the same way they do.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And just adding to the point here about knowing specific draft site rankings, they vary quite a bit between ESPN, Yahoo, Sleeper, Fantasy Pros. And if you're not familiar with how the platform that you draft on ranks players and you don't have your guys tiered, you could be in a situation where you're like, whoa, I didn't see this coming whatsoever. And I'll give you an example of, last year, I was roommates with your brother and you guys were doing your family league draft and I was kind of looking over his shoulder and you were drafting on ESPN and the ratings that I was looking at I was like, whoa, this guy here, get him, push him up, like all these certain situations where you don't want to be caught with your tail between your legs, like you want to curate your own ratings but also be cognizant of all those ratings around you.
Yeah, and know where you're drafting, right? Like the other people in your league are going to be looking at the rankings on the site, right? Especially if you're
Yeah.
drafting online. If you're doing an in-person draft, you don't get that as much, right? Which is why another reason I like in-person drafts is you don't know which site people are bringing information from or if they're bringing their own information, right? It's much more fun when you're doing that with a board and you don't know what people are going to do. That adds an additional element to it. But if you're drafting online, like the majority of you will be, just make sure you know that your site rankings. I think it's very important, and tier your guys, or mark your guys or who you want when off of the rankings sets that that you're going to be presented with. And then, so getting into our last point here, our number 4 point, fill out your bench with a purpose. There's a tendency once you get past your starting lineup that like, oh, I can kind of just get whoever, and the bench will be fine. Like every single roster spot that you're afforded within your league is very important. You want to make sure you have the best player possible at every single spot, and you want to also make sure that your bench accommodates for potential weaknesses in your starting lineup. So you want to constantly be reviewing who you have, where you're strong, where you're weak, and which players in the draft later could possibly fill any of those holes as the season moves forward. Right, you get robust RB on your bench, right? If you go heavy on wide receiver, like Matt and I both like to do, we're generally looking at a lot of running backs later, right? We're trying to get, we have the 2 starters. We're trying to get 3, maybe even a 4th guy on the bench, so that, if anything happens to our starters or any of the guys that we do pick end up hitting and can become starters because our starters aren't necessarily going to be high-end options. That's something that you want to make sure that you do with your bench spots, right? You also don't want to pick a second tight end if you can avoid it. If you do pick a tight end later, you're probably going to want a second one. So I think that's another advantage of making sure you lock in one of the top 7, top 8 tight ends. You definitely don't want a second kicker or defense. Those two, save them for your last 2 picks. You don't want to be getting in on a second one for sure. Don't do that. So, make sure that you have as many lotto tickets as you can on your bench.
Yeah, I can't tell me how many guys I've played with that have 2 defenses and they're trying to play the matchups each and every week. And I look at over under totals and stream the defense and score just as many points as they do. And they're just wasting a roster spot. So please don't do that.
Yeah. And it's just, especially in the draft, right? Like if you want to do that during the year when you have multiple injuries and you're looking at picking up Russell Wilson or you're looking at picking up Bo Nix, in a Superflex league, or if you want to roll with a defense for the next week on your bench as part of that, okay, fine. But like out of the draft, you don't want to be missing on lotto tickets, that you could possibly be hitting on. I mean, look at a guy like Jaden Reed last year going towards the end of the drafts, Raheem Mostert, end of drafts.
Puka Nacua.
Devon Achan, age of draft. Yeah, Puka Nacua, end of drafts. Like, there's countless players every single year at the end of the draft that you could have tried to get, right? And it's in Kyron Williams, another one. Like, you're not going to hit all the time. Okay, obviously, there's only a handful of these players, but the point is you want to try to load your bench with as many possibilities as possible. And if you pick a second defense, you're not giving yourself the highest chance of hitting on a player like that.
I agree.
All right, and with that, thank you so much for watching, and we hope this helps you in terms of preparing for your draft and thinking about it from a Superflex angle, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.